Shalom, I'm Mark Regev, and we're here for another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. And as per usual, I'm here with my co-host, Ruthie Blum. How are you today, Ruthie?
I'm good, Mark. Well, aside from what's going on in the world, I'm good. But before we start, I would like to point out something. We're really appreciative of all your comments. And one of them I took into account, and I thought it was very intelligent. Somebody said, "Why are you asking at the top of the broadcast to request that we like and subscribe if we haven't heard it yet?" So I take that to heart, and so I'm going to change the wording. If you like our broadcast, please like and subscribe and click the notification button. And one more thing, we're very excited to be announcing that JNS is holding its first International Policy Summit at the end of April, and we'd love for you to register for it. Okay, now on to the topics of the day. Mark, let's talk about Trump's address to Congress, which he delivered at 4 a.m. Israel time.
And he went on for a world record 100 minutes for an American president addressing Congress. And I have to tell you the truth, I'm a bit of a wonk, but I'm not too much of a wonk that I wake up at 4 a.m. to watch the address. I woke up at about 6 and I thought I'd see a recording, only to discover that he was still speaking or was just winding up and there was not yet a recording. But in the 100 minutes that the president spoke, our issues, Israel's issues, only got a very, very brief mention. As you know, the president said that, the hostages are coming out, and that's a good thing. And he talked about that he did the Abraham Accords and there could be more of that soon. But the fact that he deliberately understated Middle East issues, the war in Gaza, the hostages, just a very brief mention in what was a very long speech, I don't think it's an accident. Is there, or maybe it is. Is it design or is there an accident? And if it's design, what is the design, Ruthie?
Well, it's interesting because you first said he deliberately did it and then questioned whether it was deliberate.
All right.
I don't think there are accidents in such a thing. Those speeches they're written in advance with a lot of help from his advisors, aides, speechwriters. So I don't think it was an accident, particularly since leading up to the speech, reporters in various news outlets were saying, okay, these are the topics that Trump will be discussing. And of course, a lot of domestic stuff, but where foreign policy is concerned, everybody assumed that he was going to devote at least a few minutes to the hostages in Gaza or to his plan for the day after Hamas in Gaza. And because in the audience, in the gallery, were a bunch of released hostages, and much had been made of that. And the assumption was, as he has done before, that he would introduce them or mention them, and he did not. He just made a very brief mention, and interestingly, what he did, he mentioned two things briefly. One was saying, we're going to get our hostages out, something like that. And I thought that was the most significant thing he said, was using the word our, because he sees America and Israel on the same side of this war against global jihad.
Though, if I can interrupt you, I heard the same word. And you can have that interpretation, which is very nice for Israelis to feel that the president of the United States sees Israel and the Americans as it's all one. And if they've taken Israeli hostages, they're like, as if they were Americans. But you could also have a more minimalistic interpretation, less good for Israel, that there are some of the hostages left in Gaza, some of the people alive and some of the dead who are American citizens. Was he? I mean, this is a man who's famous for American first. Was he talking only about the U.S. citizens?
No, he was not. There is no way he was talking only about the U.S. citizens. I've heard him use the term us, we, our before in interviews and in speeches when it comes to Israel, and it's with Netanyahu, who came to the White House. No, I don't think he was only referring to U.S. hostages. Absolutely not. He also mentioned, of course, the Abraham Accords, the peace accords, because, he's all about He's talking about how he wants peace. That's why he was talking about brokering a peace between Ukraine and Russia, etc. He devoted more time to Ukraine and Russia than to the Middle East. So here's my take on it. It wasn't just that he said our and that was deliberate, but something more, I would say, something I'm hopeful about. And that is that right now there is a really delicate situation with Steve Witkoff, his Mideast envoy, having proposed a plan that Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed to that has to do with sort of extending the first phase of this ridiculous ceasefire deal, not calling it that, but rather than going into phase 2, saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a ceasefire through Ramadan, which is going on right now, and Passover, bringing us another 6 weeks. And in the first part of this, you have to release, Hamas has to release the live hostage, half of the live hostages, something like that. And then by the end, all of them, and then we'll negotiate, or in between, negotiate a fuller ceasefire. Well, Hamas, of course, didn't agree to that deal, which maybe is a good thing, because that didn't sound good to me either, because either way, Hamas has some kind of chance of staying in power, though Trump says no way about that. So Hamas rejected the deal, and Israel's response was to say, okay, no more humanitarian aid into Gaza, which I would just also like to say, it's a misnomer, humanitarian aid. We should be calling it aid to the enemy, which it has been.
So I agree with you on the point that it wasn't an accident. I mean, obviously the president can speak often off the cuff and not according to the written lines, but I think this was a written speech, and these were lines that were prepared in advance. And I think the fact that he didn't want to go into any detail or to elaborate on our issues is a sign, maybe, that there is something very serious going on behind the scenes, and therefore he doesn't want to spoil it, or he doesn't want to go into it. The proposals, the Witkoff proposals, are interesting. Half the hostages, half the dead, half the alive, are released up front, and half at the end on the assumption that you can reach an understanding. I say anyone we can get out is good, not at any price. Within the framework of the war aims, and the war aims are get the hostages out, end Hamas's rule over Gaza, and destroy Hamas's military machine, that Gaza should never again be a threat to the people of Israel. And I think the government of Israel has been successful in getting a lot of the hostages out. We've got some up to 24 live hostages still in Gaza. If we can get more and more out, I think that's a good thing.
Absolutely. It's a great thing, except Hamas has to release them,
Okay.
Mark. And the only way to get Hamas to release them clearly right now, because that's their only leverage. Before they were saying, okay, 3 and the 4, and then we'll get, as Trump called them, drips and drabs. He should have said dribs and drabs. He called them drips and drabs. No more of this. But the thing is, Hamas won't agree to it. And you know something? That is why we are amassing our troops again. And it is possible. You're absolutely right. We have to get as many alive out as possible. And that is exactly what Netanyahu has been doing. And here's the thing, though. Hamas has to cooperate. If Hamas doesn't, that's why we're the only leverage we have. And it's way too late, because Hamas has supplies for 6 months. Okay. And, you know, what's happening in Gaza right now is that the vendors who are saying now, during Ramadan, the Muslims fast all day and they feast in the evening, and they make amazing feasts, a lot of food. And that's happening in Gaza right now, too. Of course, our hostages are starving because their captors are purposely starving them. But in any case, the vendors selling this food say, oh, great, they're stopping the humanitarian aid trucks. This is an opportunity to double our prices to the Gazans, so that when they have to prepare their meals for the end of the day, for the feast at the end of each day, it'll cost them double. So it's absolutely disgusting. Everything that's going on in there is disgusting. And what we need to do is shut off their electricity, their water. We need to have a credible threat that what we are going to do if we don't see those hostages out is blitz Gaza in a way bigger operation that we did up until now.
So it's clear to me that the only chance to get the hostages out is to have a credible threat that we are willing to go in if they're not released. And that's what the Prime Minister said in the Knesset earlier this week. Hamas has to understand there is no ceasefire without the continued release of hostages. And Hamas has to understand and believe that this will happen, that Israel will relaunch our operations against them with greater accuracy, with greater firepower, with greater destruction if those hostages in Gaza aren't released. And I think that's a crucial message to send to Hamas. And what you said about the vendors, I mean, you didn't mention something that you know to be true that we've talked about in the past, that Hamas actually makes money from all this so-called humanitarian aid, because Hamas is the one who's often stealing it and then selling it. And those vendors, everyone thinks it's private sector, but they're all paying protection to Hamas, right? They're paying their taxes, so to speak, to Hamas. And this is how Hamas stays in power, by manipulating the international community's humanitarian aid, by controlling. Hamas gets to decide who gets the aid and who doesn't. That's the bottom line. They're the only people there with guns.
Well, exactly. And if the Biden administration hadn't forced Israel constantly at the beginning of the war to enter more food and more trucks and more, and it's not just food, Mark, it's cigarettes and it's chocolate and it's potato chips and it's everything. And it's absolutely appalling. But let's now talk about how those hostages got in there in the first place. And this is bringing us to the topic of the reports coming out, emerging from the military, the Shin Bet, which is the Israel Security Agency, our version, I guess, of the FBI, you'd say. And these are bombshell reports, by the way, not because there's anything in them we didn't know already. They're bombshell because, especially from the, both the army and the Shin Bet, but because they both groups have tried to cover up their part, and even what they're willing to reveal is so outrageous that we can just imagine what they're not saying.
I think you're overstating that.
No.
They're deliberately covering up. Let me make my point before you
Okay.
disagree with me. Yes,
Okay.
but both the army and the Shabak say publicly that they screwed up, that they got it wrong, and I think. Okay, you can say once they make their admission, they don't go into too many details. That could be a criticism, yes. But there's no doubt that Israel was let down by its security services, by its military on October 7th. And the first thing, the intelligence failure, that they took us by surprise. And despite all the different signs that were out there, all the information, that information was interpreted incorrectly. Everyone was sure that Hamas was deterred, that Hamas didn't want war, and information was digested within the system accordingly. And they took us by surprise. That's the ultimate problem with October 7th. The intelligence services, both the Shabak and the military intelligence people, failure. And the head of military intelligence resigned. The head of the Shin Bet will have to resign too. These are people whose job it is, their work description is to give warning in advance of attack. They failed to do so. But that's the only one failure. All the other reports are showing what we knew in advance, beforehand anyway. But even if we were taken by surprise, the forces on the ground were not in a position, were not deployed in a way to deal effectively with the attack. And I heard yesterday they've given little reports on every different kibbutz, every different community, and what happened there. I mean, in some places, it took 3 days to get terrorists out of civilian communities, out of the different border settlements along the Gaza frontier. 3 days. And the army was not in place. The army was slow to react. When the army reacted, it didn't necessarily react in an organized fashion. Forces weren't moved to deal with the issue as effectively and as expeditiously as was needed. And many, many, many people were killed as a result. Now, there are countless examples, and this needs to be said, of IDF soldiers on the ground who fought very bravely and very courageously and very professionally against the terrorists, many of them killed in battle trying to defeat the terrorist onslaught. But as a structure, the army and the Shabak's failure is a colossal failure. It's a failure with a capital F, and that just can't be swept under the carpet.
No, and by the way, when you say, well, he's going to have to resign, no, he should have been fired, and he should have been fired a long time ago. And this brings us to, I have to go back to President Trump. One of the things that Trump has entered office and saying, we're getting rid of the deep state. We're getting rid of bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats running the show. Israel needs to do the same. Our deep state, our army, as you said, we have the bravest soldiers. We have amazing, everyone in Israel is a soldier and everything. We have amazing soldiers. We also have amazing Shin Bet operatives. What we don't have are the amazing command. It's an old boys network of woke, left-wing, anti-Netanyahu people who already have their eye on political parties after their jobs and on think tank appointments, particularly left-wing think tanks. Now, let me say that the head of our Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, you say, oh, of course he should resign. First of all, the nerve of that guy to get up and say, okay, here are my conditions for resigning. One of them is I get to appoint my successor. The other is this, that, and the other thing. Who the hell is he? He is not the boss. Netanyahu is his boss. And by the way, I'll get to my criticism of Netanyahu for not firing him. But let me reveal something to you. Way before even this government was in power, months before the election that this government got elected to represent, and before the judicial reform protests, before Hamas saw everybody in the streets protesting judicial reform, before the election, Ronen Bar got up at your university, at Reichman University, where you have a think tank, and he gave a speech. And his speech was, great, what is his speech? It was a woke, disgusting speech about how he's not worried about the external enemy isn't our biggest problem. Our biggest problem in Israel is our internal strife, is our schisms, societal schisms. So at the time I said, this is dangerous. The guy who's there to fight terrorism, to protect me so I can go to sleep at night, like those people in the kibbutzim thought they were going to sleep safely that night. And he's worried. He's giving us a sociological interpretation. How dare he? And I knew then this is a dangerous guy. And again, this is before anything. Before Netanyahu was elected this term, it was before the judicial reform protests. He should have been fired on October 8th is when he should have been fired. And another thing is that Israelis have this thing, well, then how come Netanyahu doesn't resign? Well, let me tell you.
Let's get into that separately. I want to deal with the woke issue, and then we'll discuss Netanyahu's responsibility. And it's clear he has. But you talk about woke, and I want to say the following. I think it's more complicated, and I'll tell you why. We know that one of the groups of people that were sending reports up the military chain of command that the Hamas were planning an attack were the young women, the military observers who sit right there on the border with all their electronic equipment. And these young women doing their national service, 18, 19, 20 years old, too many of them were killed on October 7th, too many of them that were taken hostage, thank goodness, though they were released recently as part of the deal that we had. But these young women were sending up the chain of command that they could see Hamas was planning something, that we should be careful, that Hamas is planning an attack, and they were ignored. And these young women, I think, were ignored, one, because they were women, and what do women know? So that's good old-fashioned macho sexism, and also because we in the higher ranks, we have the big picture. And what are these little soldiers doing their national service? I've been in the army for 20 years. I've been in the army for 25 years. I've got all these stars on my shoulder, you say in America, yes? But in Israel, you say falafelim, right? But they don't have rank on their shoulder. Why do we need to listen to these people, right? And so it's not wokeness. It's also good old-fashioned male sexism. What do women know about these issues?
That was lower down the chain, though. Let me tell you, it was the more immediate commanders of these young women. They weren't doing national service. That was their military service.
Mm-hmm.
Military. They were soldiers.
Yes, sir.
Of course, they weren't given arms. They were sitting right near the border. This was just, you still can't believe your ears or your eyes when you hear this. They didn't have weapons. They were right near the border because we thought our technology would save us from these barbarians a few hundred meters away. Okay. Well, but those girls were warning. And I say girls, by the way, I know some people say you have to call them women, but I call 19-year-old girls girls. I mean, because I'm old and I have, I just can't help it. I don't think of them as women. Those girls were doing their job in an excellent way. And they were telling, and we know for a fact that they were telling their immediate commanders that Hamas wasn't only planning something, they were training in urban combat.
Correct.
They could see it. And they went home
And
on
they were
weekends
ignored.
And they told their parents.
Correct.
We're telling them. And it wasn't that they were ignored. It was worse than that. Their immediate commanders, not the high up, not the head of the army, their immediate commander said, if you don't stop whining, you're going to be court-martialed. Well, so I'd like to know which young guys did that, because for the most part, as I said, it's the higher command that should be court-martialed right now, should be sitting in jail, not sitting on a heavy pension they're about to receive. No, I don't know who those young guys are, but I'm sorry, whoever they are, they should be in jail for many years. They caused the deaths of so many people, and those girls themselves were ambushed. They were burned. Some of them were taken hostage, and the rest were slaughtered.
Well, what you said,
slaughtered.
What the army has been doing is they've been meeting with the different communities that suffered massacres to explain what happened. And some of these meetings get very tense and very emotional because people are rightfully and justifiably, they're furious at the army that they were told the army is going to protect them against these terrorists in Gaza, right? And I've heard one or two people say, you hear the recordings from these meetings. They say, you were going to retire, even if you have to resign now. You're going to retire from the military with your big fat pension. It's not right. It's not justified. You failed, and my family members died, and my home was destroyed because you weren't doing your job. And there is this anger. But now let's get to your point, which you wanted, and I cut you off, and I apologize for doing so. The point about Netanyahu, because there is also, okay, people are upset with the military didn't do its job. People are upset with the Shin Bet, the Shabak, that didn't do its job. But there's also, even amongst people who voted for this government, there are also an anger. Netanyahu branded himself as Mr. Security. And many people in this country also hold him responsible. Do you hold him responsible?
Okay, so first of all, yes. In the bigger picture, he's responsible, not on the actual night and morning of October 7th, because all of these arrogant army and Shin Bet and other chiefs didn't call him and tell him that something was cooking. Nobody warned him. Nobody called him. He was woken up like I was at 6:30 in the morning with sirens. Okay, so I do not hold him responsible for that specific moment at which Hamas struck, nor do I hold him responsible for trusting in his military chiefs for telling him that Hamas was deterred, that he's supposed to trust them. That's what they're there for. I don't hold him responsible. What I do hold him responsible for, but before I get to that, I just would like to say everybody has to make a distinction, no matter who's responsible and who's to blame. Everybody has to make a distinction between elected officials and appointed ones. Don't make any mistakes. These guys, Netanyahu was elected. His ministers were elected. The Knesset was elected. The other people we're talking about were appointees, and that they should believe that they have more power than the people is outrageous, and it's got to stop. But Netanyahu...
Can I? I want to jump on that point, and then I'll...
Yes.
I think it's a crucial point. The last... You can't compare it, but the last failure, it was a failure of less scope, yes, but that Israelis felt about a conflict was the Second Lebanon War in 2006. Right. And at the end of that war, Prime Minister Olmert was accused of leading Israel to what, lives were lost, and there was the public attitude was very, very despondent that we didn't win the war decisively, and we paid a high price, and there were missiles on our home, and there was a whole series of failures. There was an investigation, and all this. But Olmert, his government fell because his coalition partners didn't have confidence in him, and they left the government. It was Ehud Barak, actually, who was leader of the Labour Party, who pulled the Labour Party out and brought down Olmert's government. And that is, and our Canadian listeners, our Australian listeners, not our American listeners won't understand this, but Israel's a parliamentary democracy. And a government has to command the confidence of the parliament. And without that, the government falls. That's the basis. That's the fundamental principle of parliamentary democracy. Now, Olmert's government fell because of the political, he no longer had the confidence, forget the Israeli public, he no longer had the confidence of the Israeli parliament, of the elected representatives of the people. Netanyahu, for all reasons we can discuss, has strong control over his party, the confidence of his party, and his coalition has actually gone bigger until Ben-Gvir pulled out, but he's managed to widen his parliamentary base. And so I agree with you entirely. There's a difference between people who are civil servants who failed at their job and people who were elected. Now, I'd give you the following, like 9/11 happened in the United States. Huge failure, right? Al-Qaeda took the Americans by surprise, and America paid a high price for being caught by surprise. There wasn't an expression that George W. Bush needs to resign. George W. Bush needs to get his act together and win the war, yes? And he faced election it's different. It's different, and I agree with your point.
Well, it was a little different with George W. Bush because he was a new president when this happened.
Yes.
And it happened on his watch, but it was brand new. Whereas Netanyahu has been prime minister of Israel with a break here and there for 16 years. So there's a difference. And so of course George W. Bush had to get his act together. But interestingly, guess what? The FBI was also there undermining the FBI, just like our Shin Bet. The FBI was very culpable over 9/11, but that's another issue. Again, Netanyahu has an election. I mean, unless his government falls, unless some party pulls out and makes it have a minority, his government, people will go to the polls again and maybe vote him out or vote other people out. It doesn't matter. He has to face the public in a year and a half or something, or beforehand, depends. And we, the public, will penalize him or not. These other guys are appointees. They should be fired immediately. They are not doing their job. Again, if Netanyahu is not doing his job, he will get voted out. That is the way you fire a prime minister. The way you fire, that is Shabak or the army or anybody else, is to fire him. Say, thank you very much for your service. Out of here. And you certainly don't let him appoint his successor. It's just what's happening with our court system. It's why we needed judicial reform. Our entire system, that's why I said our entire deep state, it's gotten so big for its britches, it thinks it runs the country. And you know what? It's right. It has been. And where I hold Netanyahu accountable is for not firing people. He takes too long. He waits till they resign. There is where I think he should have fired the attorney general. He should have made sure. Again, it depends on the hierarchy and the way that works. The justice minister apparently has to fire the attorney general. In any case, Netanyahu doesn't like to fire people, and there is where I hold him accountable.
The other issue, though, that he's criticized for is the failure to establish a national commission of inquiry to investigate. And we have in Israel a tradition of national commissions of inquiry. After the Yom Kippur War, famously, there was the Agranat Commission, and after the massacres at Sabra Shatila, there was such an inquiry. And the idea now there should be an inquiry. And Netanyahu so far has said he doesn't agree to that. He thinks that would be a kangaroo court. I'm using my words, not him. and he's calling for a special commission where half the members are chosen by the government and half by the opposition, and this would be an independent commission. He doesn't believe that the way the law is written at the moment for National Commission of Inquiries, that he'd get a fair show. Do you think he has a point?
Oh, he definitely has a point. And he's not the only person who feels that way. The bulk of the public has lost its trust in the judges. I mean, one of the troubles with a commission of inquiry, of course he wants one. We all want a commission of inquiry. We have had a national trauma, the likes of which we don't remember in the history of the state. Okay, but the trouble is that the people who are in charge of these inquiries, we already see what they are. They're the judges on the Supreme Court. They're the judge. This is a system where it's bound to fail. It's not just that Netanyahu will be blamed. The point is that these are people washing each other's hands. We can't have them protecting their buddies, the ones they appointed, the ones they want to win the next election. You can't have that. So yes, you have to have representatives. But the idea is that we need a representation from, for example, on such a commission, you should have hostage families. You should also have some from the legal system, from the army, from everything, and politicians. And not just all those people who are self-appointed kings and queens of this country. Sorry.
Let's go straight to the major problem is, according to the current law, the commission and the people sitting on the commission is chosen by the Israeli Chief Justice. And the current Chief Justice, I mean, it's solely his choice. He gets to choose the 3 or 5 people on the commission. And unfortunately, the way he was elected, or appointed, I should say, to be Chief Justice, there were many questions raised. Everyone knows in Israel today the tensions that exist between the executive branch and the legislative branch and the judiciary. And I think it's fair to say that as long as those tensions are there, no one in the executive branch is going to see this current president of the Supreme Court as some sort of objective person who's going to be able to do an independent inquiry.
That president of our Supreme Court was illegitimately, he basically appointed himself and his choir of yes men. His whole rise to that position very recently was a total joke. It was illegitimate. It's not just controversial. He had also violated the law. The guy is corrupt, but also he should never have been appointed the way he was. And that is why many of our officials did not attend the ceremony
where he was appointed. Yes. No, don't just say many. The head of the Prime Minister, the Minister of Justice, and the Speaker of the Knesset. In other words, the heads of the executive branch and the judiciary and the legislative branch refused to attend the ceremony.
That's right.
And no,
rightly so. But I agree with that.
But let's keep rightly or not rightly out of it. Let's just say, but it's a sign of the tension between the branches. It's a sign of the lack of confidence. And then no one should be surprised that the executive branch doesn't want this particular president of the Supreme Court. They don't believe that they'd get an independent investigation.
No, first of all, that's true. They're right to believe they wouldn't. But also, when you say there's tensions between them, it makes it sound as though they're equal. It's both sides. There's tensions. I would describe it differently. I would say it's not that there's tension. The tensions are caused by the fact that our judicial system has stolen powers over the years that it doesn't deserve. And again, it's true. We don't have a constitution. A lot of people are saying we need to write a constitution. That wouldn't necessarily solve all the problems. But one of the things, but again, the left basically quashed the whole judicial reform. But again, going back to responsibility for Netanyahu and also Justice Minister Levine, okay, they quashed it. Where are you guys? Why? We voted for this. We voted for judicial reform. We voted for that. Why? I feel that Netanyahu is very brave when it comes to withstanding pressure from the Biden administration, pressure from Iran, missiles from here and there and there. And he's more afraid of the deep state than he is of the Ayatollahs. And that is something that I've always been concerned about.
I want I want to say the following. When Israel is fighting a war, right? I think the idea of deferring controversial issues to another date while we're fighting, because we should try to be as unified as we can when we're fighting a war, I think the Prime Minister would be right in adopting that policy. The question is the other side allowing him to do that? And I think there's a whole question that needs to be raised here, because I do believe difficult issues can be put off when you need to have unity to fight and win this war. Once again, though, that has to be on both sides and not on just one side. We've come to the end of our time, Ruthie. With your permission, can I say something? I got this WhatsApp from my son, and I wanted to share it with you and with the listeners before we say goodbye. My son sent me something that I hadn't seen. He sent me a CIA report, a public report, because it was on the internet. He sent it to me. Did you know that the population of Gaza grew in 2024, in other words, the year of the war, by 2.02%? And he said to me, my son, very correctly, okay? He said to me, all these people who say genocide, 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 it's repeated on US university campuses, it's repeated at the UN, it's repeated, I don't know, in the media, genocide, Israel is committing genocide. This would have to be the first and only place in history where in genocide the population has actually grown. And with that thought, I say goodbye to you until next week.
Looking forward to it, Mark.